Okay, so we are in the book of Hebrews, and yesterday we had kind of went over a little bit of a kind of overview of like the landscape of where we're starting in the book of Hebrews. We know that the book of Hebrews is in the New Testament. We are not 100% sure as to who the writer is. We know that he is an early believer, whoever he is. He would be someone who would be like kind of part of the inner circle. So like once Jesus ascended into, so, Jesus is born, he lives, he dies. We know that he resurrects 3 days later. We know that he lived for 40 days. And then during that time, remember that while he was alive, his disciples were 12. We know that Judas betrays Jesus and he kills himself. So he's down to 11. So after Jesus resurrects, he fulfills that position. Um, and then we know that after Jesus ascends, well, Jesus doesn't fulfill the position, the other disciples do. After Jesus ascends back into heaven, they fill the 12th position and they also appoint some people who are kind of like, I'm gonna call like the disciples, like the inner circle. Then they appoint some people who I would like equate in our minds as like deacons, kind of like the next layer of inner people, um, who are going out into the different areas around where Jesus lived and spreading the gospel there. We know that like the apostle Paul was not a disciple, nor was he really a deacon, but he was so anointed by God after meeting Jesus on the Damascus Road that even the disciples respected Paul's, words. So we see that there's this like in the early church, which is like what you would read describing this time, they would say that there are the disciples and then you know, like this other layer of people who are around the disciples. This is who they're theorizing is one of the authors of the book of Hebrews. And as we know, it is a letter that he is writing. John MacArthur says that it is to three different potential groups of people, like audiences, that he's writing particular parts of this letter. The first group is people who had a Jewish background and they're now believers. The second group would be people who had a Jewish background. They know who Jesus is, but they haven't fully like surrendered their lives to him. And then the third group would be everybody else. Like they just people who don't really even know who Jesus is, may or may not have had a Jewish background. We will just call them non-believers. And I mean, y'all, even now we could see that we know, and probably in our lives have been a member of each of those audiences. So that's why I feel like the book of Hebrews is really palatable for all of us, because I think we all can identify a little bit, just through our lives with each of those different audiences. So I think that's why it's kind of relevant for us. We talked about yesterday kind of the landscape of what was going on. We talked about the how, we were separated from God and God created this communion again through the old covenant that he made with Abram, and how, the Jews truly did track their lineage back to Abram. And they said, God made this promise to Abram that his descendants would be God's chosen people, and we are God's descendants, and they felt like they were just born into that role. And they clung, that's probably not a word. They clinged to that promise in their times of despair, that they were God's chosen people and that they were promised the promised land. And I mean, we see through the Old Testament that they went through a lot. They were enslaved in Egypt. God delivered them out of Egypt. They wandered in the deserts for a million years. Like we could see all the things that they had endured and they still were clinging to those promises that God had made them. And we see that God gave them the law. They all had problems following the law. I can probably sum up the Old Testament in this very short explanation. God gave them the law. They couldn't follow it. God would send a prophet with a message that said, like, hey, Jews, let's get your act together. God's going to judge you and you're going to go to hell if you don't get your act together. And God would do some big miracle with the prophet to make open the people's eyes. Okay. Think about it. Daniel in the lion's den. They didn't die the lions didn't eat him. David and Goliath. He killed Goliath with a stone. Jonah and the whale. God didn't let Jonah live 3 days in the belly of the whale. Think of all these miracles God performed with these Old Testament prophets. He would get the people's attention. They would listen to what the prophet said for probably a short period of time. They kind of got their act together. And then they would fall back into their old ways again. And then God would send another prophet and he would say, hey, let's get our act together. And then he would perform a big miracle. They would follow them for a little while, then they would fall off again. That is like the theme of the Old Testament again, 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 and again. And through each of these prophets, we'll see today that God continuously kept pointing, like, this is a prophet, but there is one that will come who is going to solve all of the problems. Like each prophet was pointing forward. And we now know, because we live post Jesus, that Jesus is a culmination of those promises. But then we see that, with these laws, with the prophets, the Jews couldn't follow the rules. And so they would have to offer up these sacrifices. That's where we kind of ended yesterday, was man's ability, man's like desire to try to have communication with God and it not be interrupted. They would have to constantly perform these sacrifices. That's kind of where the Old Testament ends, where the Jews are just trying to follow the rules, trying to earn their way into heaven in their own strength, and trying to constantly present these sacrifices in an effort to get right with God, if that makes sense. Okay. That's where we start the whole book. So one thing I'm going to tell you is we have a few new people here, is the version of the Bible that you read might be a little bit different than the one that I read. I read two different versions depending on how I'm reading it to you. One is my tangible Bible is She Reads Truth. I find that version is a little bit different than the NIV, which is what I typically would read on my computer. So I want you to just pay attention to whatever Bible you're reading. What is the version of it? There's the American Standard Version. There's there's a bunch of different King James Version. All of them are going to have a little bit of a different variation. It's the same Bible. I don't want you to think like, oh, whoever drafted this Bible just decided to change the words. No, it's just a different interpretation. So if you're reading something and you think like, oh, Jeray's not saying the same words that I'm reading on my Bible, it's because I'm just probably reading a different version. What I'm reading right now is the NIV, New International Version. Okay, so chapter 1, verse 1. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in many various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. So honestly, y'all, our whole study today is probably going to be on those two verses. I find that commentary that I read, John MacArthur, he is a very slow starter. Like he really gets a slow start, but then he kind of gets going. So every time we get a new chapter, I feel like he's a little bit slow. So I apologize. So we see that in the in chapter 1, the writer like wastes no time in just getting to the point. Like he didn't introduce, there weren't any um introductions or anything like that. He just kind of like really gets to the point about what he's getting to. And as we talked about yesterday, the theme of this book is Jesus's superiority over all things that ever were. That Jesus is better than any previous prophet, any previous promise, any previous provision, anything that God had did in the Old Testament. Jesus is a culmination, a resolution, a fulfillment of everything that was before. So the audience he's first speaking to in here is going to be Jewish believers and then Jewish non-believers. Well, I'm saying like Jewish non-believers, I mean like Jews who knew who Jesus was but haven't submitted their lives to them. He's first providing like encouragement for Jewish believers because remember they were kind of like under persecution at this point. And then trying to nudge Jewish people who acknowledge who Jesus was but didn't fully accept him yet. He's just trying to nudge them in the right direction. So he's talking about in verse 1 versus verse 2. Verse 1, he's talking about the Old Testament. Okay. Let me see. I lost my. Okay. In the Old Testament, we are going to see that God was preparing the world for Jesus. Okay. It says in the scripture that he spoke. Let me see how it's said. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in many various ways. So, in order for us to know who God is, God speaks to us, okay? And in the Old Testament, he did it various ways. He spoke to us through the prophets. He spoke to us in all of the books of the Old Testament, and he did it a bunch of different ways. He would speak to us through a story. He would speak to us through a prophecy. He would speak to us in like poetry, like the Psalms or Proverbs. Um, he would give us warnings. He would give us encouragement. Like you see all the different ways that God was speaking to us in the Old Testament. John MacArthur gives us very interesting, I never really thought of it this way, but he gives a very interesting like analogy. It's not the most profound analogy for me, but I was thinking that it might be for one of you. He says that the way it's hard for us to even imagine like the greatness and vastness of God's abilities and perfection and power and the greatness of Jesus and who he truly is, because he says that man lives in a box where it is like reality and tangibleness and in the world. Okay, so imagine that each of us are in a box. And we know that there is a supernatural place outside of the box and that God is outside of the box. And we desire our ability to know what's going on outside of the box. Like, we have a lot of questions. God, why is it this way? I want to be in your presence. But it's hard for us to even fathom it because our brains are so limited that we're stuck in this box. And John MacArthur said that in going through all the world's religions is man's like desire to try to get outside of the box. He said that like, and listen, I don't know a ton about other religions, but he was saying like, Hinduism, there's supposed to be this, you do so many good works and you meditate for so long that suddenly your brain just becomes outside of the box and you're just in the supernatural. He said the same is true for the Muslim religion, that you work yourself into this place where you just get outside of the box. But he said Christianity is the only religion where The supernatural actually came inside of the box with us. We didn't have to do anything to get outside of the box. God sent Jesus as a man, a tangible, earthly, fleshly man. God sent himself inside of the box so that he can be in communion with us. And John MacArthur says that that is the difference between Christianity and every other type of religion on the earth, in that we have a tangible proof of God's love for us and his desire to be in communion with us. Um, and so I don't know, he just gave that example. I thought it was kind of interesting. I guess I'd never really thought about it that way. Um, but in order for you, it helped me understand this point. In order for us to know who God is, he has to speak to us. And it's not something that we just have the ability to just know as a result of our birth. You know what I mean? And so the question is, how does God speak to us? In the Old Testament, we see, so remember, verse 1 is about what happened before Jesus. So how did God speak to us before Jesus? He spoke to us through the prophets. Okay. So he would, like we said before, he would send these people. The people would come and they would share some sort of message that God had for them. Um, and he gave them a message. And y'all, we see many times that the prophets didn't want to give the message to the people. They were scared. They felt like they were not equipped enough to truly give a God authorized message to the people. We see this with Moses. When God meets with Moses on the mountain, and he there's the burning bush, and he tells Moses, you're going to go into Egypt and you're going to free my people. Like, Moses was a murderer who was running away from his problems living in the desert. And Moses literally like tells God, like, I'm not your guy. I'm not the one that you want to be doing your work. Like, I have dirty hands. I'm not perfect. I'm not any of those things. But God still chose these people um to send his message. And so I want that to be some encouragement for you today, that if you feel like you are not equipped to do kingdom work, like you're not equipped to share the gospel with somebody else, you're not equipped to talk about Jesus or the Bible with somebody else, I want this area of our study today to be the flashing red light that you need, because God called all these prophets in the Old Testament to speak to the people. They felt not enough. And so if you're feeling not enough, you feel like you can't do that kind of work, the message for you this morning is that you can. Like I always say, God equips the called. When he gives you a task, and we'll see that before Jesus ascended, his task to us was to go out and make disciples of all nations. That was our job. That is what he wants us to do. As believers, that is what we are called to do. And, I just find all too often we're moms and we're working and we have husbands and we have jobs and we have laundry and dishes and homework and all those things. And we tell ourselves, I'm gonna do kingdom work. I'm gonna share the gospel one day, and I'm gonna do that on a mission trip, or I'm gonna do that, you know, at church on Sunday. No, like where you are today, what's today? January 7th, 2025. Today, God is calling you to do kingdom work. He's calling you to do kingdom work at your job. He's calling you to do kingdom work when you help your kids get ready for school this morning. He's helping you do kingdom work when your husband texts you today to see how your day's going. Like, he called these prophets to send a message, and he's calling us to send a message too. So I don't want you to think that just because we are stuck in the, the little hamster wheel of everyday life, that we're not being called, just like these Old Testament prophets, to spread the gospel, I mean, because we are. I don't want you to think that we're not. And if they were able to do it, we're able to do it. So I just want to give you that confidence today. So God spoke to us through the prophets, these, half-wit people. The Bible also says that the scripture says he spoke to us in many different manners. He spoke to us in visions in the Old Testament, in parables, in symbols. Sometimes he gave us warnings. He provided us the law. He gave us morals. Sometimes he spoke in poetry. He gave us encouragement. So you see how in the Old Testament, God revealed who he was to us through speaking to us in all these different ways and through all these different people. And we kind of see that the Old Testament was progressive. Okay. I didn't really know what that meant, but this is what it means, is that the Old Testament's kind of like an onion where we have like a nugget, and then we have another layer and another layer and another layer. So God continues to reveal and speak to us, and he builds on it. Okay. So we see, Adam and Eve in the garden. And then we move into Abram, and then we move into Isaac, then we move into Jacob, and that his 12 sons, and that whole story. And in each of those stories, God reveals a little bit more about his promises that he's making to these people, and God's goodness, and how we need to fear him, and all these. So I want you to kind of think of the Old Testament as layers. Like he builds on itself. The note that I wrote is the Old Testament was progressive. That is, it was meant to build on itself. With every book, we get another piece of the puzzle, tiny bits of truth again, again, and again. So then, let's see. This was a good little example I'll share with you. He said that God gave us pieces through each of the prophets. Through Noah, God revealed where the Messiah would come from. Through Micah, God revealed the town in which the Messiah would be born. Daniel, he told us the time of Jesus's birth. Malachi, God gave Malachi the message of who the forerunner for Jesus was going to be, which we know as John the Baptist. And through Jonah, he gave the prophecy of Jesus's resurrection. So I thought that is like such a good example about how God gave little pieces through the Old Testament. And you kind of have to read it all as a whole, which, again, if you know anything about me, the Old Testament's not my absolute favorite because there's a lot going on back there, talking to animals, people sleeping with their family members. It's a wild ride. But listen, we're going to get there eventually, but not today. My last little note about this verse is the New Testament, Jesus, which we know that to be true. The New Testament was a fulfillment of what God spoke about in the Old Testament. Okay. So we have the Old Testament's building up, and then we saw all the prophets pointing to Jesus, pointing to Jesus, pointing to Jesus. New Testament, Jesus is on the scene. So the Old Testament was a promise, and the New Testament is a fulfillment of that promise. Jesus said in the New Testament, do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I came to fulfill it. And so I want you to see that it's like God continuously made this promise, and Jesus is a fulfillment of that promise. So back to the actual scripture, it says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in many various ways. So I feel like we have a very good understanding of that. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. So now in verse 2, we're jumping to the New Testament. And we're seeing that the entire focus of the New Testament is Jesus. The Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament, tell of Jesus's life. And each one of them is the story of Jesus's life um, from a different perspective. So they're not contradicting one another. They just kind of fill in gaps where the other ones like are kind of lacking. So we see like, I'll give you an example. In the book of Luke, he gives the most extensive explanation of Jesus's birth, whereas the other gospels kind of like brush over that. Well, I mean, they talk about it, but they don't go into as much depth as Luke does about the birth of Christ. So it's kind of like, imagine 4 people witnessed something, I'm gonna say a car accident, and they were each standing on different sides of the accident. They would all see the same accident, but just from different perspectives. And that is what we see when we see the Gospels. We have 4 accounts of the life of Christ just coming from 4 different people. And then we see that the Gospels tell of Jesus's life, and the epistles comment on his life. They are instructions to new believers about the I like to say like the logistics of faith, and things that are it's instructions about how to do things correctly, and then how to not do things correctly, how to not fall into temptation, how to not fall back to old coping mechanisms. So those are the epistles. So in the New Testament, we have the 4 Gospels, the epistles, and then we have Revelations, which is at the end, which is supposed to be an explanation about end times. When the writer of the Hebrews tells, sorry, I'm running out of time. When the writer of Hebrews tells the audience here, but in these last days he has spoken to us, that is for you and me, that probably doesn't mean a whole lot. But I want you to know that the audience to whom he was speaking, that would have meant a lot, because they knew that in the last days the Messiah was coming. They were very, like, the Jews were very in tuned with their scripture. They knew it very, very well. And so for the writer to say, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his son, the writer is giving Messiah thoughts to the reader. He's saying, God is speaking to us through his son, and his son is the Messiah that he has been pointing towards this entire time. And then he's just kind of again confirming who Jesus is when he says, whom God appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. So again, just that Jesus is the culmination of every promise God made in the Old Testament. And so, sorry that was so slow, but we will move through Hebrews a little bit faster tomorrow. So if you're just watching the recording, I will stop it right now. And I will see you tomorrow.